The night air was thick with silence, the kind of silence that makes every heartbeat sound louder. In the long, narrow hallway of the army hospital, the lights flickered softly, and the nurses whispered in low voices, afraid of waking the injured soldiers resting inside. Suddenly, the heavy sound of boots echoed on the floor, slow, strong, and full of command. Everyone froze because only one man walked like that. The colonel. He had returned from a long mission, and word had already spread through the camp that he was angry, very angry. No one knew the reason, but everyone could feel it in the air like a storm about to break. The guards stood straight. The doctors looked away. Even the patients tried to stay silent because when the colonel was in rage, no one wanted to cross his path. At the far end of the hallway stood Aisha, a young nurse, barely 24, with gentle eyes and a calm face. She was known for her courage and kindness, for the way she spoke softly to wounded soldiers and helped them smile again. But that night her hands trembled slightly as she cleaned the bandages of a young soldier named Bilal. His arm was badly burned, but his eyes were full of gratitude for the woman who refused to let him die. Few hours earlier, Aisha had done something that no one else had dared to do. When the colonel's men brought Bilal in, they had orders to leave him untreated because he had disobeyed a command during battle. The colonel had said he needed to be punished, not saved, but Aisha could not stand by and watch a man die for a mistake, so she treated him in secret, risking her job and maybe even her life now. As the sound of the colonel's boots grew louder, Aisha knew he had found out. The door burst open and the colonel stepped in, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform spotless, his eyes sharp as steel. Behind him 2 soldiers followed, standing stiff like statues. The colonel's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Where is she?" he said. And though he did not shout, every word carried fire. One of the nurses pointed toward Aisha's station. Her lips trembling, she whispered, "There, sir." The colonel walked toward her slowly, each step echoing like thunder. The soldiers followed close. The young nurse stood still, her face calm, her heart racing beneath her uniform. She wanted to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. When he reached her, the colonel stopped, staring down at her with a look that could break stone. "So you think you can break my orders?" he said, his voice deep and cold. "You think your mercy is greater than my command?" Aisha lifted her eyes to him, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. She was not just a nurse. She was a woman standing against power. She spoke softly, her tone steady. "I only did what was right, sir. The soldier would have died if I had waited." The colonel's jaw tightened. His hand clenched at his side. The 2 guards shifted uneasily. They had seen this before when anger took over. No one could predict what would follow. The colonel took 1 step closer, his voice rising. "Right. You speak of right and wrong to me. You dare question my discipline." Aisha did not step back. Though fear ran through her body like cold water, she said, "Sir, I serve the wounded. I follow my oath to save lives, not to take them away." For a second, everything was quiet. Only the ticking clock on the wall could be heard. Then, in one swift motion, the colonel raised his hand high. The air trembled. The nurses gasped. Bilal tried to rise from his bed, but pain forced him down. The world seemed to stop. Everyone waited for the sound of the slap that was sure to come. But it didn't. Aisha did something no one expected. She took 1 small step forward. Her eyes locked on his, and with a calm voice she said, "If you hit me, sir, you hit every woman who stands for what is right." The colonel's hand froze mid-air. His eyes widened slightly. Surprise flickered for a moment. Then anger returned. But something deeper had already been shaken inside him. He was used to fear, to silence, to obedience. But this woman was not afraid. She stood tall even when his shadow covered her. The room held its breath. No one dared to move. The colonel's hand slowly dropped to his side. The tension in the air turned heavy and strange, a mix of pride, shock, and unspoken respect. He looked around at his men, their eyes down, their loyalty shifting quietly toward the brave nurse who had faced him without trembling. He turned sharply, his coat swinging behind him, and walked toward the door, his voice low but full of warning. "You will regret this, Nurse Aisha. No one defies a colonel and walks away free." The door slammed shut behind him. leaving only the echo of his words. The nurses rushed to Aisha, whispering, "Are you all right? What were you thinking?" But she didn't answer. She only looked out the window, her face calm again, though her hands still shook slightly. Outside, the sound of the colonel's jeep starting broke the night silence, and as it drove away into the dark, Aisha whispered quietly to herself, "If truth brings regret, I will face it." The storm had passed for the moment, but deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of something far greater, something that would test her courage like never before. The morning sun rose slowly over the camp, its light spilling across the dusty ground and broken fences. Birds sang somewhere far away, but inside the military hospital everything felt heavy. The memory of the colonel's anger still hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. Nurses whispered softly as they worked, glancing toward Aisha again and again, wondering how she could stay so calm after what had happened the night before. Aisha sat by Bilal's bed, changing his bandages carefully, her hands gentle but her mind far away. She could still see the colonel's eyes, sharp and cold, his hand raised in fury, and the silence that followed when he could not bring himself to strike her. That moment played again and again in her mind like a scene that refused to end. She did not know why he had stopped. Maybe it was her words, maybe it was her calm, or maybe it was something else that neither of them could name. Bilal watched her quietly, his face pale but his eyes full of gratitude. He whispered, "You saved me, sister, but now you're in danger because of me." Aisha shook her head slowly, her voice low but steady. "No, Bilal, I saved you because it was right. Danger comes and goes, but doing right stays forever." Outside, soldiers moved like shadows, cleaning their weapons, marching in silence, but there was tension between them. They had all heard what happened. Some called Aisha brave, others called her foolish. Yet none could stop thinking about that moment when the colonel, the man they all feared, had lowered his hand before her. It was as if something in their world had cracked by noon. The colonel's jeep returned to the base, the engine roaring like thunder, dust rising behind it. Everyone stopped what they were doing. He stepped out wearing his dark sunglasses, his face unreadable, his voice quieter than usual, and that silence was more frightening than any shout. He walked straight to his office, the door closed behind him. No one dared to follow. Inside, he paced back and forth, his mind on fire. He could not forget her eyes, the way she looked at him without fear. Every time he tried to justify his anger, something inside whispered that she was not wrong, but his pride would not let him listen. He slammed his hand on the table. The papers flew everywhere. "She made me weak," he muttered, in front of everyone. He called his assistant, a thin man named Rafiq, who always followed orders without question. The colonel said, "Prepare her transfer papers, send her far, far away to the border camp. Let her learn what defiance costs." Rafiq hesitated for a second, his lips trembling. "Sir, the border camp has no medicine, no supplies. It's dangerous." But one sharp look from the colonel made him silent again. He nodded and left to do what he was told that evening. When Aisha finished her rounds, she was called to the office. Her heart raced, but her face stayed calm. She walked in and saluted quietly. The colonel did not look up at first. He just slid a file across the table. "Your new assignment," he said, his tone flat. "You leave tomorrow at dawn." Aisha opened the file and her eyes widened slightly. She knew what this meant. The border camp was a place no one wanted to go, far from safety, full of danger. But she did not protest. She simply nodded and said, "As you command, sir." Her voice calm as ever. The colonel expected her to plead or beg, but her quiet acceptance cut deeper than any words. For a moment he almost spoke, almost told her to forget it, but pride rose again and tied his tongue. He looked away and said, "You are dismissed." That night, Aisha packed her small bag. Folding her uniform carefully, the nurses gathered around her, their eyes full of worry. One said, "You can refuse, Aisha. No one will blame you." Another said, "Please don't go. It's dangerous," but she smiled softly. "If I refuse, what lesson will I leave behind?" she said. "Sometimes the road of truth is lonely, but it must be walked." As darkness fell, the camp lights flickered like stars trapped on earth. Bilal tried to stand, holding on to his bandaged arm. "Sister, take care. I owe you my life," he whispered. Aisha touched his shoulder gently. "Then live well, Bilal. That will be enough," while everyone slept. The colonel sat in his room staring at the empty file on his desk. The one that once held her name. The silence pressed against his ears, and though he told himself he had done the right thing, a strange unease grew inside him. He poured himself a glass of water. His hand trembling slightly, he whispered to himself, "Why couldn't I hit her?" But there was no answer before dawn. The sound of an old army truck rumbled near the gate. Aisha climbed in with her bag, her white scarf fluttering in the cold morning wind. The road ahead was long and rough. She looked back once, seeing the camp disappear slowly behind her, her heart heavy but steady in his office. The colonel watched from the window unseen by anyone, his jaw tight, his mind caught between pride and something he could not name, something like respect. He turned away quickly as the truck disappeared into the mist. The road stretched endlessly, lined with dry trees and cracked earth. Aisha sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon, not knowing what waited for her, only knowing that whatever it was, she would face it without fear. And somewhere deep inside, the colonel's silence began to change shape, no longer the silence of power, but the silence of a man who had met his match. Though he didn't know it yet, the story between them was far from over, and destiny was already writing the next chapter with invisible ink. The road to the border camp was long and silent. Dust rose with every turn of the old army truck. The sun burned high above and the driver said nothing. Aisha sat quietly at the back, her scarf covering her face from the wind. Her heart calm, though she knew danger was waiting ahead. She had seen fear before, but this silence carried something heavier, a warning she could almost feel in her bones. The camp appeared suddenly beyond a broken fence. Rows of damaged tents stood in the dry heat. Soldiers moved slowly, their faces tired and thin. The smell of gunpowder and sickness filled the air. As soon as the truck stopped, a young officer came running. His uniform dirty and his eyes hollow, he saluted weakly. "Madam, we were told you are the new medical officer," he said, his voice cracked like dry wood. Aisha nodded and stepped down, her boots sinking in the dust. Everywhere she looked, she saw pain. Some soldiers coughed, others lay on thin mats, shivering from fever. The camp had no medicine, no clean water, and no hope. Aisha looked around slowly and said in a calm voice, "We will start with what we have." Her courage shining through her tiredness, the soldiers watched her in silence, unsure if she was brave or just unaware of how hopeless things were for the next few days. She worked without rest, cleaning wounds with boiled water, tearing her own scarf into bandages, teaching the men to help each other. Her hands never stopped moving. Her soft voice gave comfort where no medicine could. Slowly, the camp began to change. Soldiers started smiling again. They began to salute her not because of rank, but because of respect far away, back at the main base. The colonel sat behind his desk trying to forget her name, but every time he looked at a report, her image rose before his eyes. He had sent her away to break her spirit, yet strange reports started coming in. They said the border camp was improving, soldiers were recovering, morale was rising. The colonel's anger deepened. He slammed his hand on the table. "So she wants to be a hero," he muttered. "We will see how long her luck lasts." He called Rafik again, his voice sharp. "Tell the supply unit to delay the medical shipment to her camp." "No supplies for 2 weeks." Rafik hesitated. "Sir, the men there need medicine. They are fighting sickness." But the colonel glared at him. "That is an order," he said coldly, and the room fell silent back at the border. The situation worsened. Soldiers began to fall ill faster. One by one they collapsed. Aisha worked through the nights, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She had no proper medicine left, so she used herbs from the hills, mixed salt water for fever, and made simple remedies with what little she could find. She refused to stop, even when her hands started to bleed from exhaustion. One night, as she sat outside under the dim lantern light, she looked up at the sky, whispering softly to herself, "You can take away medicine, but you cannot take away hope." Her voice steady like a quiet prayer. The next morning, a small group of soldiers from another post arrived with a letter. The seal carried the colonel's mark. She opened it slowly, her heart already knowing what it was. The letter read, "Your performance has been noted, but your methods are not approved. You are reminded to follow discipline and command." She read it twice. then folded it and placed it in her bag, saying nothing. The soldiers around her looked worried. One of them asked, "Madam, why does he hate you so much?" She smiled faintly. "Because truth makes power uncomfortable," she replied, her tone soft but firm. The men looked at her with admiration. They had never seen anyone speak with such calm strength that night. A storm rolled in. Heavy rain and loud thunder shook the camp. Tents flew off their ropes and water rushed through the mud. Aisha ran from tent to tent, helping the injured, her voice cutting through the storm like light in darkness. When dawn came, the camp was half destroyed, but no one had died. Every soldier said the same thing. "She saved us far away." The colonel sat alone in his office. Hearing the latest updates, his face unreadable, something inside him twisted uncomfortably. He had tried to break her, yet every obstacle only made her stronger. Rafiq spoke carefully. "Sir, her men are calling her the angel of the border now." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Enough," he said sharply. "She defies authority, not fate. I will go there myself." The next morning, a helicopter lifted from the main base. Slicing through the clouds, the colonel sat inside, staring out the window, his jaw tight. The wind whipping against his uniform. Below him stretched the endless desert road that led to her. He told himself it was just inspection, but deep down he knew it was something more, something he could not explain. At the border camp, Aisha stood outside. Looking at the rising dust in the distance, her eyes narrowed slightly, her instincts whispering that a storm was coming again. The soldiers around her felt the same tension. The sound of the helicopter grew louder and louder until it landed right in front of the camp, sand and smoke swirling around like a warning. And when the colonel stepped out, tall and cold as before, every soldier stopped moving. Even the wind seemed to pause. Aisha stood still at the center of the camp, her scarf fluttering behind her, her face calm, her eyes sharp. The man who had tried to break her had come back, but this time the game was different, and neither of them knew what destiny was about to bring. The sky above the border camp turned gray as the helicopter blades sliced the air like angry wings. Soldiers ran to stand in line, their boots sinking in the mud left from the night storm. Aisha stood at the edge of the camp, her scarf fluttering behind her. She did not move, her eyes calm yet sharp. She knew who was coming, and she knew this meeting would not end quietly. The helicopter door opened slowly and the colonel stepped out, tall and proud, his uniform spotless despite the dust in the air. His eyes scanned the camp like a hawk searching for weakness. The soldiers saluted stiffly, their faces blank, but deep inside they were uneasy. Everyone had heard of his temper. Everyone had seen what happened before. The silence in the camp grew heavier with every step he took. He walked straight toward Aisha, the mud splashing under his boots, his face stern and unreadable. The wind tugged at his coat. His voice came out low and cold. "So this is how you run a camp," he said, looking around at the torn tents and wounded soldiers. "Chaos everywhere." Aisha stood firm, her hands folded behind her. "We have done the best we can with what we have." "Sir?" she said softly, her tone respectful but steady. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "With what you have," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean without orders, without supplies, without discipline?" He took another step closer, his shadow falling over her. "You disobeyed me once and I let it go. But now you have made a name for yourself here. They call you an angel. Do you think this army runs on angels?" The soldiers nearby glanced at each other nervously. Some of them clenched their fists, others looked down, afraid that even their breathing might anger him. But Aisha did not move, her voice calm as ever. "I did not ask them to call me anything, sir. They just needed someone to believe in." The colonel's jaw tightened, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Believe in," he said with a cold laugh. "They should believe in orders, not in you." He looked around, his voice rising. "Look at this place. This is not discipline, this is emotion. And emotion has no place in war." Aisha took a small breath, the air heavy with tension. "War may break bodies, sir, but emotion heals hearts. And without hearts no army can stand." Her words floated softly in the air, but they struck deep. The colonel's hand twitched slightly, the same way it had on that night in the hospital. Everyone saw it, everyone held their breath. He took another step forward, his eyes burning. "You speak too much for someone who should only follow," he said, his voice rising. "You think courage gives you the right to question me?" Aisha looked up at him, her eyes steady and unblinking. "I only question what breaks humanity." "Sir," she replied, her tone calm but firm. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. The colonel's hand rose again, high and fast. The soldiers gasped. Remembering the last time, the wind seemed to stop. Even the sound of the helicopter faded away. But before his hand could fall, someone moved. It was one of the young soldiers, his uniform dirty, his arm wrapped in bandages. He stepped between them and shouted, "Sir, please, she saved my life." "She saved all of us." His voice cracked with emotion. "If you punish her, then punish me too." The colonel froze, his hand still raised, his eyes flicking between the soldier and Aisha. Before he could speak, another soldier stepped forward, then another, until a line of men stood in front of her, their faces brave but trembling. One of them said, "We would be dead without her, sir. She brought hope when there was none." The colonel's hand slowly dropped to his side. His eyes burning with disbelief, he had led men into war, commanded hundreds with fear and authority, but never had anyone stood up to him like this. Never had soldiers chosen a nurse's courage over his command. He looked at Aisha again, her expression unchanged, her calmness cutting deeper than anger. He turned away for a moment, breathing hard, his pride twisting inside him like a blade. He wanted to shout, to punish, to prove he was still in control, but something in his chest stopped him, something he could not name. Suddenly, the sound of another vehicle approached, a jeep carrying a high-ranking officer from headquarters. The man stepped out quickly, his eyes scanning the scene. "What is happening here?" he demanded. His voice sharp, Aisha saluted immediately. "Inspection, sir," she said quietly. The colonel straightened his posture, trying to regain composure. The officer looked around the camp, noticing the exhausted soldiers and the improved conditions. "This place has done well despite the lack of supplies," he said. "Who is in charge of medical operations here?" Aisha stepped forward. "I am, sir," she said softly. The officer nodded with respect. "Impressive work, nurse. Your report has reached headquarters. Your efforts are being recognized." The colonel's face turned pale, his heart thudding in his chest. The officer looked at him next. "Colonel Rahman, we will discuss the delays in supply delivery when we return," he said pointedly. The soldiers exchanged glances. The truth was clear. The colonel's own orders had caused the suffering. The helicopter blades began to spin again. The officer turned to leave. Aisha saluted once more. The colonel stood silent, his pride crushed beneath the weight of his own actions. As the wind from the blades whipped across the camp, Aisha's scarf lifted high in the air like a white flag of quiet victory. When the noise faded, only silence remained. The soldiers stood taller now, no longer afraid. The colonel looked at her one last time, his voice low and strained. "You have won their hearts, nurse, but remember, war does not forgive softness." She looked back at him with calm eyes and said gently, "Then maybe war needs forgiveness more than soldiers do." He said nothing more. He turned and walked toward the jeep, his footsteps heavy with something deeper than anger. Maybe regret, maybe shame. Aisha watched him leave, knowing that this was not the end, but a turning point, a moment where power had met compassion. And for the first time, compassion had not bowed. The evening sky turned red as the sun sank behind the hills. The border camp glowed softly in the fading light. Soldiers sat in small groups, their tired faces finally showing a trace of peace. For the first time in many months there was laughter, quiet but real, the kind that comes from hearts no longer afraid. Aisha walked through the rows of tents, her steps light, her eyes warm. She checked on every soldier, smiling softly when they greeted her with respect. Far away at the edge of the camp, the colonel stood near his jeep, staring at the horizon, his jaw tight, his thoughts tangled. He had come to punish her, but somehow she had turned his own men against him. His pride burned like fire. Yet deep inside something else stirred, something that made him uneasy. A voice he had long buried under anger and command. A small voice whispering that maybe she was right. Rafiq, his loyal assistant, stood beside him silently, afraid to speak. The colonel finally said, "They do not fear me anymore." "Do they?" His tone low and bitter. Rafiq hesitated, then said carefully, "They respect her, sir. She earned their hearts." The colonel's hands clenched at his sides. "Respect," he muttered. "I built this camp on discipline, not emotions. I gave them order and control, and she took it away with kindness." That night, the colonel called a meeting in the command tent. The officers gathered, sitting stiffly, their faces tense. He looked at them one by one, his eyes sharp. "We have lost control," he said. "Our soldiers follow their feelings now, not their duty." But one young officer spoke softly. "Sir, she made them stronger. They follow orders now because they want to, not because they fear." The colonel glared at him, his voice turning cold. Are you questioning my command? The officer swallowed hard. No, sir, I'm only saying she changed their hearts. For a moment, silence filled the tent thick and heavy. Then the colonel waved his hand. Dismissing them, he was too tired to argue. His thoughts heavy like stones. After they left, he sat alone, staring at the lantern flame flickering on his desk. Its light small yet steady like her courage, he tried to blow it out, but it refused to die easily. Outside, the wind carried the sound of soldiers singing softly, their voices blending with the hum of the night. Aisha listened from her tent, her hands clasped together. She felt peace but also worry. She knew the colonel was not a man who accepted defeat easily. She whispered to herself, "The storm is not over yet." At dawn, a message arrived from headquarters. Sealed and marked urgent, Rafiq brought it to the colonel, his hands shaking slightly. The colonel tore it open and read, his face turning pale. The message ordered an investigation into supply delays and misuse of authority, the very actions he had taken to punish Aisha. Headquarters had found out, and now he was the one being questioned. He slammed the letter down, his anger mixed with fear. "Who reported this?" he demanded. Rafiq looked down. "No one knows, sir. But they said evidence came from within the camp." The colonel's eyes darkened. "So even my men turned against me," he said bitterly. "All because of her." Later that morning, the investigation officers arrived in a convoy, their vehicles raising clouds of dust. They spoke with the soldiers, checked the supplies, read the records. Everywhere they went, they found one name written in the reports. Aisha, her handwriting clear, her notes honest. She had written everything she saw, even the missing supplies, without anger, without fear, just truth by afternoon. The senior officer in charge called the colonel and Aisha to the command tent. The air was thick with tension. Soldiers gathered outside quietly. Listening, the officer spoke first. "Colonel Rahman, the reports show negligence and misuse of power. You delayed vital supplies without reason. These actions risked lives," his tone firm. The colonel tried to defend himself. "I acted for discipline," he said sharply. "She broke command." "She acted without permission." The officer looked at Aisha next. "Is this true?" he asked. Aisha stood straight, her voice calm. "Yes, sir, I acted without permission, but not without reason. The soldiers were dying, and I could not wait for orders that never came." Her words were gentle but powerful. Every man outside could hear her through the canvas walls. The officer nodded slowly. "Sometimes orders fail, and courage takes their place," he said quietly. Turning back to the colonel, "You have lost the respect of your men, not because you are strict, but because you forgot compassion." The colonel's shoulders stiffened. His face pale, the officer signed a document and handed it to him. "You are hereby suspended pending further review." The colonel stood frozen. His world collapsing in silence. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. His voice low and hollow. "So it ends like this," he said. Aisha looked at him, her eyes soft. "It doesn't have to end in anger, sir," she said. "Sometimes losing power is the beginning of finding peace." He looked at her for a long moment, something breaking inside him. Then without a word he saluted, a gesture filled not with authority but respect, and walked out of the tent. The soldiers watched quietly. No one cheered. No one spoke. The air was thick with emotion. As he walked away toward the waiting jeep, the wind blew across the camp, carrying with it the faint sound of Aisha's voice comforting a soldier. It echoed softly, like a song of healing. The colonel paused for a second, his eyes on the horizon, and whispered to himself, "Maybe she was right," though no one heard it but the wind. That night, the camp was quiet, the stars bright above. Aisha stood outside her tent looking at the endless sky. She thought of the colonel, of his anger and his fall, and felt no victory, only a strange sadness mixed with hope. Sometimes people change only when everything breaks, she thought. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was not the end of his story, but perhaps the start of a new one. The morning after the colonel left the camp was calm, the sky clear, the air soft with the sound of wind brushing against the tents. Soldiers moved quietly, working with renewed strength. The shadow of fear that once hung over them was gone. In its place there was a sense of peace and unity. Aisha walked between the rows of men, checking their bandages, sharing soft words of hope, her heart heavy but steady. She had not seen the colonel since his suspension. yet something in her heart told her that their paths were not finished. Days turned into weeks. The camp healed slowly. The soldiers recovered. Laughter returned. Messages from headquarters brought good news. The investigation had closed, and the camp would receive full support again. Aisha was recommended for an honor medal, but she refused it politely, saying, "The real medal is seeing them alive." Her words spread across the division, and soon her name became known beyond the border, not as a nurse who defied orders, but as a woman who brought light into a place of darkness, far away, in a small town surrounded by green fields. The colonel sat on his porch in silence, his uniform folded neatly inside a box, his medals packed away, his eyes watching the children play on the road. He had left the army quietly after the inquiry ended. No longer a man of command, now just a man searching for peace. For weeks he carried guilt in his heart, guilt heavier than any rank. He replayed the moment he had almost raised his hand against her, the look in her eyes, calm and unbroken, haunting him like a mirror that showed him his own weakness. Every morning he woke early, walked through the town and greeted the people he had once ignored. His voice softer now, his anger gone like smoke after rain. He began helping at the small local school, fixing broken chairs, painting walls, reading stories to children whose fathers were away at war. The villagers were surprised, they whispered. "The colonel has changed." But he said nothing, only smiled faintly and kept working. One afternoon, while sorting through old letters, he found one envelope sealed and unsigned, the handwriting familiar and neat. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short note written in gentle words. "Sir, you taught me that courage can exist even in power, but I hope one day you will see that kindness is not weakness. It is strength in its purest form. May peace find you." He stared at the letter for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. It was from Aisha, though she had not written her name. He knew it was her heart speaking through every line. That night, he sat outside under the stars, the same stars that had once watched over his command tents. He whispered softly, "Maybe peace is not won by orders but by understanding." His eyes grew wet, but he smiled, a real smile, small yet full of life, the kind he had forgotten long ago. Months passed, and a new order came from headquarters. A health program was being launched for soldiers' families, and they wanted him to supervise logistics because of his experience. He hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to face the past. But then he saw the same letter on his desk, and he decided to go. When he reached the capital, he entered the large training hall where doctors, nurses, and officers gathered. The air buzzed with energy and purpose. As he stepped inside, a familiar voice reached his ears, soft, yet strong. It was Aisha standing at the front explaining the new medical relief system for field camps, her face calm, her eyes bright with quiet confidence. She saw him too, but she did not look away. Their eyes met across the room. Time seemed to pause, and in that silence there was no anger, no fear, only understanding. After the session ended, he approached her slowly, his steps careful. When he stopped before her, he saluted, not out of duty, but out of respect. "You were right," he said, his voice low but clear. "Power means nothing without heart." She smiled gently. "And heart needs courage to stand before power," she replied. The old bitterness between them vanished like mist under sunlight, replaced by something deeper, quiet forgiveness. They began to talk not as colonel and nurse, but as two souls who had walked through fire and come out changed. He told her about the school he helped rebuild, about the children who reminded him what peace looked like. She listened with soft eyes and said, "That is true service, sir, helping those who have no voice." He nodded slowly. "You taught me that without even trying." Weeks later, together they started a new program, traveling between small camps and villages, teaching young officers and medics how to lead with compassion, not fear. Their story spread quietly, inspiring others. Soldiers began calling them the voices of balance, the strength and the soul of service. And wherever they went, hope followed like sunlight after a storm. One evening, as they sat near a quiet river after a long day. The colonel looked at the reflection of the sky on the water and said softly, "You know, that night when I raised my hand, I thought I had all the power in the world. But now I see, real power is the ability to stop yourself." Aisha looked at him and smiled. "And real victory is not when others bow to you, but when your own heart learns to bow to truth." The river flowed gently between them, carrying away the echoes of war, leaving behind peace, far away. The wind carried the sound of laughter from children playing in the field, and as the sky turned golden, the colonel felt something he had never felt before. Freedom not of command, but of spirit, and Aisha, sitting beside him in quiet grace, knew that destiny had done its work, transforming anger into understanding, and pride into peace. Their story had begun with a raised hand, but it ended with joined hearts, proving that even in the hardest of souls, kindness can plant a seed that grows into change, the kind that never fades.